Welcome to the Explainer. So today, we're going to do something incredibly practical together. We are going to completely upgrade your decision-making process. Think about it. We make thousands of choices every single day, right? But how often do we actually take a step back and examine the structural integrity of how we think? Well, today, we're diving into a highly structured, scientifically backed approach to problem solving. We're going to learn exactly how to break down any complex issue using a specific framework. And by the end of this explainer, you're going to walk away with a tangible blueprint to dramatically improve the choices you make in your daily life.
Here is our roadmap for today. First up, the fair-minded thinker. Second, we'll dive into the 8 elements of thought. Third, systematic problem solving. And finally, we'll look at the proof for better decision-making.
All right, Section 1, the fair-minded thinker. We're talking about moving beyond naive and selfish thinking here.
Now, before we can tackle complex problems, we really have to get our mindset right. So I want you to honestly evaluate your own default style. When you're faced with this tough, complicated situation, what kind of thinker are you? I know, it's a bit of an uncomfortable question, but identifying our baseline is absolutely the first step to upgrading it.
Based on Dr. Faraj Ganbari's research on critical thinking, people generally fall into 3 main categories. First, you've got the naive thinker. This is someone who kind of just believes whatever they hear. They don't question the message, and honestly, they avoid figuring things out because, well, it just takes too much effort. Then there's the selfish critical thinker. Now, these folks are actually very smart. They're good at thinking, but they use it purely to get what they want. They'll scrutinize opposing views but give their own ideas a total free pass, often to manipulate others. And finally, we have our ultimate goal, the fair-minded critical thinker. This person relies heavily on facts. They're generous. They actively try to understand where other people are coming from, and they're constantly working on their own reasoning. If we want to solve real-world, complex problems, this is exactly the approach we have to cultivate.
But actually pulling off that fair-mindedness takes some serious work. To build true intellectual character, you need a few key traits. You need intellectual humility, which is basically just admitting you don't know everything. You also need intellectual courage. That means speaking up for what the evidence shows is right, even if it's super unpopular. And you definitely need intellectual perseverance, because let's face it, thinking through complex problems is hard work. You can't just throw in the towel if you want to make great decisions.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 8 elements of thought. This is our step-by-step problem-solving system.
Let's break down the first 4 elements. Picture this. Let's say you're staring down a massive career decision. First, define your purpose. What are you actually trying to achieve here? Is it more money, better work-life balance, pure fulfillment? Second, state the exact question. Are you asking, should I quit my job? Or are you asking, how do I transition to a completely new industry within 6 months? See how laying out the exact problem completely changes the solution you'll look for? Third, gather your information. You need hard, accurate facts here, not just opinions or feelings. And fourth, and honestly, this one is crucial, identify your assumptions. What unquestioned beliefs are hiding in the background? Are you assuming you won't get hired just because you think you lack a certain degree? Stating these 4 elements clearly gives you a rock-solid foundation to build on.
Okay, with that foundation laid, let's hit the final 4 elements. Element 5 is concepts. Maybe your guiding concept in this career crisis is long-term growth versus immediate burnout. Element 6 is inferences. Based on the hard data you gathered, you infer that staying in your current role is going to stunt your long-term growth. Element 7 is your point of view. This is your final data-backed conclusion. Something like, I need to transition industries within 6 months to actually thrive. And finally, Element 8, implications. If you accept this conclusion, what are the real-world consequences? Maybe it means a temporary pay cut for long-term happiness. Processing your career choice, or any problem really, through these exact steps guarantees a highly structured, well-reasoned decision.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. We need to understand how our brain actually processes all of this behind the scenes. Notice how information on the left leads to inference on the right. That pathway right there, that's our conscious thought. But look underneath that. The assumption sits right there in the unconscious mind, acting like an invisible filter that bends and warps the information before it ever even becomes a conclusion.
Let's really nail down what an assumption actually is. An assumption is a belief we take completely for granted. They're hidden away in our unconscious minds. And, this is the kicker, they are usually not based on any concrete information. Unchecked assumptions are quite literally the biggest traps in decision-making. Why? Because they corrupt your data without you even realizing it's happening. Just to be absolutely clear, look at this side-by-side comparison. An assumption is an unquestioned belief that is not based on information. An inference, on the other hand, is an extrapolation based on information and concepts to give actual meaning to data. When you're applying the 8 elements of thought to a problem, you have to actively hunt down your assumptions. You've got to drag them into the light and replace them with logic-driven inferences.
Section 3, Systematic Problem Solving. Let's talk about formalizing critical thought.
So how do we formalize all this? Absolutely love this quote by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. He said, "The greatest challenge to any thinker is stating the problem in a way that will allow a solution. Defining your problem correctly using element 1, purpose, and element 2, the exact question, is doing exactly what a scientist does when they formulate a hypothesis. Getting those 2 elements right is literally half the battle won."
Finally, Section 4, Proof of Better Decision-Making. Let's look at some empirical evidence from a 2025 educational study.
You might be wondering, does all this structured thinking actually make a measurable difference in the real world? Well, let's look at the proof. In a really fascinating 2025 study, researchers took 5th graders in a public school in central Mexico and split them into 2 groups. The control group learned their science curriculum normally, business as usual. But the experimental group was explicitly taught using the structured steps of the scientific method: observation, question, hypothesis, experimentation, and conclusions, which, if you think about it, is essentially the 8 elements of thought adapted for a classroom. They then tested both groups on their critical thinking skills over a 14-week period.
The results from this were undeniable. When looking at the change in critical thinking scores from the start of the study to the end, the control group actually saw a negative residual of -3.53, but the experimental group, they achieved a positive 4.11. Learning those formalized, structured steps tangibly and rapidly increased their actual ability to think critically.
And it wasn't just critical thinking. When they tested scientific thinking scores, the difference was even more staggering. The control group dropped to a -6.37, while the experimental group, the kids who practiced structured problem solving, shot all the way up to 5.66. The intervention was a massive success across the board. These researchers essentially proved that when you are forced to consciously observe, ask exact questions, and gather evidence, rather than just passively receiving information, your brain literally gets better at processing reality.
So what does that mean for you and me? The study explicitly listed the cognitive skills that improved in these students: classification, problem-solving, decision-making, and logical reasoning. Think about that for a second. By simply adopting a structured framework, these students significantly upgraded how their brains process choices. And hey, if it works for 5th graders navigating a science class, it is absolutely going to work for you when you're navigating a complex project at work, a tough financial choice, or a major life transition.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. All this information is only as good as its application. You now know the difference between a fair-minded thinker and a naive one. You know exactly how hidden assumptions can corrupt your inferences, and you have the 8 elements of thought ready to use as your personal checklist. So I'm going to leave you with this challenge. How are you going to apply the 8 elements of thought to the biggest decision you have to make today? Don't just guess. Be systematic about it. Be scientific. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and happy thinking.